All right, joining us now, reporter for The Washington Post, Emma Brown. Emma wrote the Washington Post report revealing Christine Blasey Ford as the author of the confidential letter that accuses Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh of sexual assault more than 3 decades ago when they were both high school students in Maryland. Welcome to the show. Emma, I guess, first of all, just give us the background. How did the interview come about? Why did she decide to come forward? I understand she called the Washington Post tip line a few months ago?
Yes, she sent a text to our tip line in early July, and she and I talked then, and she even then really didn't want to come forward. She just really wanted somebody to know what had happened to her, she said. Around that same time, she contacted a congressperson too, and told that person, and wasn't ready to come forward. So over the summer, she struggled and tried to figure out basically what she was going to do with this information. She said she had a civic duty to tell it, but she also understood that it was going to mean, if she came forward, it was going to change her life.
And so why did she come forward now?
She said, as things started to leak last week, The Intercept reported that there was a secret document, and then there were further reports about what was in the letter that she had written to Feinstein. Reporters were starting to show up at her door, at her workplace. She felt her privacy was already being chipped away at. She said, she said to me, these are the ills I was trying to avoid anyway. So now her calculation shifted, she said, and she was ready to come forward.
Casey Hunt. Casey Hunt has a question for you. Casey?
Emma, and I'm not sure if you would have spoken to her yet about this, but it seems pretty clear that at least on the Republican side, the pressure is going to increase for Dr. Ford to testify on Capitol Hill, to appear in public, to tell the committee her story. Is she willing to do that?
I don't know the answer to that question. I didn't ask it to her when we were going through her story, and I still don't know the answer to that question. I mean, I think she's already made a very difficult choice to come forward with her name, but I think it's another sort of hurdle to come forward and be questioned publicly. So I don't know what her intention is at this point.
Sure. Was there a conversation with her about the fact that this would be likely? I know she clearly did a lot of preparation work with her attorney, Deborah Katz, who's very experienced in this field, taking the polygraph test. I mean, is it something that she's grappled with at all, the possibility of this public testimony, really the likelihood?
I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure her legal team has talked to her about the implications of coming forward. That is not a discussion that I had with her. I was there to talk with her about her story and try to understand it so that we could publish a story.
And a lot of what is about to happen is going to be veiled in the sort of attempting to try and find out what happened and how it applies to today. Benjamin Wittes, I'd like to go back to you on this point, because you said earlier that this is factually impossible to resolve. Why do you say that?
Well, so obviously impossible is probably a little bit of an overstatement, but it's very difficult to resolve. So the allegations are quite old. There is no contemporaneous witness that that Dr. Ford is supposedly told at the time, which is one of the things that you use in order to assess credibility. The earliest she appears to have told anybody was in 2012, none of which means that what she's saying isn't true, of course. It just means that it's hard to validate. And so I think what you're left with is and then this is to her credit, she acknowledges that there's kind of a lot she doesn't remember 35 years later. And so, even within the four corners of her story, somebody who's disinclined to believe it has, a lot of questions to ask. And so, I guess I think that at the end of the day, it's going to be very hard to put together a kind of authoritative story of this, either one that says a person came forward, made an allegation, allegation and we studied it and it lacks merit, or one that says, hey, this person was, Brett Kavanaugh was, credibly and authoritatively accused of gross misconduct. And that means, I think, at the end of the day, that most senators, or the senators who aren't already decided, are going to have a kind of gut instinct call to make about where they want to, what side they want to err on, and that's that's a very uncomfortable situation for those senators.
And ultimately, and this will bring us back to Emma, but Benjamin, people obviously at times look to the law for parameters as to how to put something into context, and there are reasons, correct me if I'm wrong, for statutes of limitations, and it's why I asked you earlier if there are legal implications here, and you said no, there are none. Could he be charged? I don't think so. Could he?
Certainly not. And the one thing that statutes of limitations, however, don't apply to is the question of should you be elevated from one lifetime appointment on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals to a lifetime appointment on the Supreme Court. And so, the fact that there are no possible legal consequences here doesn't answer the question of whether you should, a senator should support his elevation, which is really a question that doesn't have a legal answer. It just has a kind of oath of office and accountability to voters kind of answer.
So, John, Emma talked about the concerns, obviously, that Dr. Ford had about coming forward. My gosh, what are the consequences for the Trump White House? What are the consequences for Republicans for being seen going after her, attacking this woman who claims that she was attacked and feared for her life 30-something years ago? It does not seem like a possibility, even in the age of Trump, does it?
Well, there's been reporting that suggests that in the last 24 hours, some White House sources in various publications that have suggested that that's exactly what they're going to do.
Right.
I will wait and see whether that happens or not. It would obviously be, in the current political climate, not just, I don't mean just in the context of the Me Too movement and everything that's happened over the course of the last year.
Right.
I mean in a moment where the biggest political problem that this White House and this Republican Party have is with female voters, broadly speaking, and with the suburban female women of both white suburban college-educated females, and also the vast array of non-white women who make up such a big part of the Democratic base. Further alienating them would be a huge political problem. I want to ask Emma Brown this question, though. Emma, can you just talk a little bit about Mark Judge, someone who is the other, according to the alleged victim here, this is some of the other person who was in the room, who's had a statement or an interview at the end of last week. I don't believe talked to you, but you make some what going to turn out to be very relevant points about Mark Judge's contemporaneous experiences in the time frame that we're talking about.
Yeah, he did not speak to me or comment for my story, but and has strongly denied that this occurred. He's an author and a filmmaker, and one of the books he wrote is called Wasted: Tales of a Gen X Drunk, and it's about his teenage alcoholism and recovery. And in it, he writes quite a bit about sort of a culture of partying at Georgetown Prep, and about his own drinking to the point of blacking out and not knowing how he got to where he woke up. So I think that is perhaps relevant if the story that Christine Ford has told is that both Brett Kavanaugh and Mark Judge were stumbling drunk when this episode occurred. So I guess there's a question about would either of them remember this incident if they were that drunk?
Emma Brown of the Washington Post, thank you very much for your reporting this morning.
Thanks.
Joe.
Let's bring in Donnie Deutsch. Donnie, we've talked about it before. Let's talk about it some more, because it seems to me that this is the decision. These are the factors that Mitch McConnell and the Republican Party and Lisa Murkowski and Susan Collins are going to have to grapple with. even if Benjamin Wittes is correct, and I think most would say he is correct, that finding the truth in this instance is factually impossible to resolve or close to it, even if this were a he said, she said happening that occurred over 30 years ago, that Kavanaugh has denied, that Ford has talked about emphatically, even if everything factually, the way the Democrats waited, the way they held on to all of the procedural issues, all of the factual issues, it seems to me, if you were advising a political party with the Republican Party's problems right now, I mean, there are no really good options for them right now. What would you tell them?
Well, there's one option they can't walk away from. You know, this is where kind of culturally and politically the worlds are colliding. You know, in the Me Too movement, the subhead of the Me Too movement is it's time for men to listen. So if the Republicans are saying we're not even going to listen, you know, we don't even want to hear it out, that is a suicidal mission. To your point, Joe, nobody can know the facts, although to me, when somebody brings up 25 years later in a couples therapy session something, you kind of have to believe it, and then it takes a polygraph test. But that aside, I would hate to be any Republican going forward in their career, not just in this election, that will stand up and say, no, we weren't even willing to listen. That would be going against an entire societal wave that is happening in our culture. That is going against an entire gender reboot of who we are. And once again, and to John's earlier point, boy, if you look at that midterms, women, and every poll is saying right now that women are going to be coming out in droves. And I think this is the kind of thing that also starts to, not only the House is gone, we'll put the Senate in real play. If the Republicans are tone deaf here, it will be a death spiral for them.
Well, and Donnie, I say this goes even beyond the Me Too movement. If the Me Too movement had never happened, Republicans would still be able to read their poll numbers and see how poorly they were doing with women because of Donald Trump. So, again, how does Lisa Murkowski, how does Susan Collins, how does any Republican senator that hopes to get educated, not just college educated, but any women who care about the issue of choice, how do you cast that vote? And I hate to keep going back to it, but this is where we are right now.
Kevin,
they will forever be branded as casting their vote for a man who has a cloud over his head, no matter how fair or unfair that is. And that Supreme Court nominee will be the deciding vote on Roe v. Wade. The consequences for Republicans long term, with women especially, could be devastating.
This is a moment in time. Joe, you use the word branding. The Republicans, the cowardice of them, if they're smart, they're going to have to kind of pull up their big boy or girl pants at this point, understand they will be branded forever. All of the chickens are going to come to roost. And all of these people who have been quiet, who have stood by, they are going to pay for it. This is a moment in time. And if they hide at this moment in time, the rest of their political careers will pay. I hope there are some Republicans listen. This is not a gray issue. This is a black and white. At the very least, you need to say, no, we're not going to not hear evil. We need to listen. I believe Kavanaugh is dead at this point. I would be shocked if he's ever a Supreme Court justice.
Mika, you look at what some Republicans said about Al Franken, for instance.
Yeah.
What they said about allegations that Al Franken denied.
Yeah.
And you start adding that up and you compare that to what's going on right now. Again, it seems to me they're in a very difficult position. And Mitch McConnell's, at some point, he may have the votes, but at some point, Mitch McConnell may have to look at the numbers. Brett Kavanaugh was already a historically unpopular pick.
Yeah.
You'd have to go back quite some time to find another one that was as unpopular as he was. Mitch McConnell has to start asking himself, Do we want to stand by Brett Kavanaugh, possibly lose the Senate, or do we just go to the Federalist Society, have them pick another conservative jurist, and put him or her, wouldn't be a bad idea, a her, up for nomination to the Supreme Court?
There are a lot of reasons, perhaps, not to confirm Brett Kavanaugh, but if the Dems play really dirty on this, I don't think that's good for politics and for both sides down. It's what we're dealing with in the White House. Still ahead, there are 50 days until the midterms, and new polling shows tight Senate races in 2 states. Donald Trump won by double digits in 2016. We're digging into those numbers, as well as new concerns for the Republican Party, next on Morning Joe.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.